So we're going to be creating a bunch of buttons in this lesson, and the buttons are going to be generated all with JavaScript code, so we don't have any HTML elements in the body. We're going to be attaching it to the body, creating the elements on the fly. We've got one value here, an object that we can update, and that will control how many buttons are being output on the page. All of these buttons are going to be working as separate objects where we're going to be tracking values into those objects. So as they get clicked, they're all working independently, tracking separate total values that are being output into the output area. We've also got a button that will list out all of the totals. So this is what we've got currently as the totals. So for button 2, the value is going to be 6. If I click button 2, it's going to output its value, whatever the current value is, to be, and output that in the output area. And then if we update the all totals, we can take a look and we can see what these counters are. So they're all working independently, separate instances, and the values and the totals are going to be tracked into the elements themselves. And that's all coming up in this lesson. I've got a blank HTML file, so index.html, so there's no HTML elements on the page, and we only have a script tag that's linking to a script called app2.js. So going into app2.js, let's set some values. So they're going to create a global value, and this can be an object, and number of elements that we want to create. So let's create 5 different buttons on the page, and they're all going to be running and clicking function. And then within the function object, so this is going to be called, we'll call it adder. And what this will do is this will take the value of the total and then increment it. So we're going to be able to create separate page counters. So let's set up the value for this total, and we'll assign it either to the value of this total, or it's going to have a value of 0. And then take the value of this total, and we're going to increment it by 1, and then output it to the page. So we need to create some page elements in order to do this. So let's create a main element, and I'll just give it a name of output, and we'll use the document create elements, and the element that we're going to create is going to be a div. So this can be our main container div where we can output some information into. And actually we're going to create one first, we'll call it main, and then we'll create a second one and we'll call it output, and that's going to be the one we're going to output content into. So let's add them to the page. And in order to make this a little bit easier, as we're going to create a few page elements, so I'll call it elementmaker. And within this function, we're going to have some arguments, and the first one is going to be the element type. And we'll bring this value into there as we're going to be creating the element. So the element type and getting the variable value from there. And we also need a parameter, so picking up the parent element that we want to attach it to. And in this case, we're going to attach main to the document body, and then output will be attached to main, and we'll attach all of the buttons into main as well. So we'll select, and we'll return back the value of parent and do an append child of the element to the parent. So this will create a function that will allow us to easier to generate some page elements. So we'll update these as functions, and then for the element type that we're creating, it's going to be a div, and the parent of this div is going to be the document body object. So we're going to be attaching that main element to the document body, and then our output area is going to be attached to the main element object. So what this will create is going to create 2 blank divs on the page. If we go into the elements, we go under the divs. So there's our main div, and then there's our output div that's contained within the main div. So ready to create some buttons for the page and then add the input values on those buttons. So let's create a quick loop, and this loop is going to generate the buttons, and we can use the element maker as well for these. We can also pass in another argument in here, and this can be whatever we want as the text content. I'll just call it HTML. So for both of these, it's just going to be blank, but we're going to be using it when we're creating the buttons. So when we select the element, we'll update the text content of the element object, and that will contain the HTML. So this is just regular text, or we could update the inner HTML, which would make a little bit more sense if we're creating it as HTML. So that gives us an opportunity as we're creating the buttons to label the buttons as we're looping through the loop. So we're going to loop through while the value of I is less than val number. And this way we've got all of our variables at the top, so making our application fully dynamic, and it's going to provide more flexibility into when we're creating these elements. So increment it by 1. And then here we're going to create all of the buttons on the page. So let's select, we're going to create the button maker. So let's select that same function that we used, and this will just create some buttons on the page. And we can give it a variable name of button, and this is going to create a button. And whenever this button is going to be clicked, then we're going to on-click to the adder, and it's going to track it separately. So we want to attach it to main, and we'll give it a name for the button. So we can use the template literal, so that's the backticks there, so you can have a dynamic value for the button. So give it a value of button, and then within here we can add in the value of I plus 1. And we're going to add those to the page, so that adds in the 5 buttons to the page. We can do as many buttons as we want, so we can add in a whole bunch of buttons if we want. And then for the button, add the onClick event as we're creating the buttons. And this is going to run to the adder function. The adder element is going to select the event target, and we'll just log that out into the console right now. So we'll get the event target, and that's going to be the element that initiated the click of the button. So going into the console, so it's going to be selecting the different buttons. And this way we can also get the text content from the button. And we can use the text content property of the button in order to update the output. So it's outputting the button value. So now within the output area, let's update the value of the inner HTML. And we'll set that using the backticks to what we've got for the text content value. And I'll just simplify this by selecting a name. So I'll just call it name v, and we can get the text content value of the element. So once we click the button object, since this is going to be an element and we're getting the name from the element, so we'll get that value, output it to the page, and then within the value we can output whatever we've got for the value of total. So this creates a whole bunch of buttons that are going to have separate tracking on the buttons, as they're all creating separate instances of the object. And button 8 is at 12 and so on, so we can see all the different values for the buttons and whatever the current value is of the buttons. If we want to create a separate button that's just going to output all of the totals, so let's do that, and we're just going to add that to the page. So just call it button main, and then element maker on the button. And this is going to have a separate function that's going to run. So we want to output all of the totals and just have that as the button value. So it's going to create a main button there, call it all totals. And then for the button main, adding in the click event, so on click. And let's do an anonymous function for the click. So I want to run through all of the button elements and then output them all on the page. So we want to select all of the button objects and return back the totals that are contained within those buttons. We need a good way to select the buttons. If we just select all of the elements with the button tag, we're going to get all of the page buttons. So let's select the button, and we're going to use the class list, and we're going to add a specific class to the button, so it's going to make it a little bit easier to select, and then we can distinguish it from the main button. So we've added a class of btn. If you go and you look at the HTML code of the elements and open up the different buttons, they're all going to have a class of btn except for the last button that we created. So that gives us a way to select those and easily distinguish between them. And let's go back to the console. And now we can create a selection of the elements that have a class of btns. We can use the document query selector since they're all going to be on the page. Query selector all, select all of the elements with a class of btn. So it's going to select all of those buttons. And then now we can loop through the buttons using a for each loop and then return back each element. And within the elements, that's where the total is going to be sitting. So we can also retrieve back the totals from each one of the elements as we're looping through. So let's do a ternary operator. And this is just going to be whatever the message output is. So if L total is not equal to, or if it's equal to undefined, that means that it hasn't been initiated, so that button doesn't have a value to it. And we can also, as we're looping through, we can also set the button total value to be 0 here as well. So that's another way that we can do that. So we can see if it's undefined, and we'll do that afterwards, we'll set it to 0. So it's not going to return back any undefines. So if it is undefined, then we return back a value of 0. Otherwise, we're going to return back of the value of the element total. And then within the console, let's output the message where we'll select each one of the buttons, and we can retrieve back the index value as well. So the index, and then we'll output the element or whatever the message value is. So when we click all of the totals, they're all going to be sitting at 0. Let's click some of the buttons and increment the totals. We'll clear the console. And now we see that button 7, which is actually labeled with button 8. So it's a little bit there. So let's just update the index values as well. So update the value for button 8, and we see that it has a value of 9. So this value is sitting within total. And instead of doing undefined, we can also set btn to 0. And that way we don't even need this line because by default, this value will be already set at 0. So this gives us a way to, a lot easier to track that information, and we can select the information, and this means that we can also output it on the page. So as we want to generate a report, essentially, we can create an element, button totals, and this can generate a report for the buttons. Let's create another output area. So just after we create all of the buttons, and I'll call this output 1. And this is also going to get attached to main. So this is where we can output the totals. And then going into output 1, and we'll set the inner HTML. And this HTML will be whatever the HTML object is. So as we loop through, we're going to take the HTML, and we'll update it. And we can create a div there, or we could create an unordered list. And we'll create a list item and then also close off the list tags. You can also generate the page elements as well. So in this case, this is just another way of doing it. It's going to result in the same thing where we're going to update and output into the page those results. So we'll create a bunch of list items, and then we have to close off the unordered list tag. So we do the all totals. That's going to list out all of the button totals there, and it'll give us an opportunity to click the button again. So we don't have any totals yet. So let's add those totals in where we've got the total for the button, and that's coming from the index plus 1, or we can actually even get the element text content as well. So element, so all of this is sitting within the element, so element text content, and then we can set whatever we've got for the element total. So get totals, and now let's increase some of these values, and that gives us a total for what we've currently got within the button counts. So again, this is fully dynamic, so you can set whatever number of buttons you want, and that's going to generate all the buttons. We're going to always be able to generate the totals, and these are going to be working as independent objects. So they're all separate instances of the object, of the button object. And when we're adding the event to the object, this total, because this is referencing whatever the current main parent element is, that's where we're referencing that object and using that object in order to store the totals. So this gives us a way that we can store totals separately and run the same function for the click event. And let's add one more item into this project where we're going to make the page elements more colorful. Or you can update the buttons, generating a random background color for the buttons. And I'll set that up as we're creating the buttons. So button style, and set the background color. Property, and this is going to be using the math random, where we're going to be returning back a random value, so math random, and then converting that to string, setting it up as a base 16 string value, and we want to slice out only the 6 characters starting at 2, ending at 8. So that generates a bunch of colorful buttons for us. And also, if you want to apply any other button styling, you can do that here as well, where you can apply the color of it to be white. So that will stand out a little bit differently. And the reason that this works is that when we're using the button, the element maker, we're using append child. So if we just use append, it's actually not going to return back the element object, and it's going to throw an error. So you do need to use the append child, which is different than the append because the append doesn't have a callback and it doesn't return back the element that's being referenced in here. So we could do it as well where we're doing an append, so doing a parent append, but this is going to be a few more lines of code, but we can also just return back the element, and this is going to result in the same thing. So it is a little bit shorter to just keep it within the one statement where we're doing the append child all at the same time. So also, because we're setting a color, a background color, we can also get the element background color. So when we list out the totals, let's add in the background color for the list items, and we're going to generate that. So selecting from the element, whenever we're looping through, we want to get the background color of the element for the list item. And this is actually, it's probably going to make more sense if we create an unordered list. So let's update some of this code here, and we'll select out for the element, and as we create the list item, we'll get the element background color, and then we'll apply that to the list item as we create those. So we want to clear out whatever we've got currently in the output 1 HTML, and we can just blank that. And then from here, let's create the unordered list. And now that we've got the function to element make, we can easily create that. So that's going to be an unordered list. We don't have any content in it. And that will remove us the option of having to do that. And as well, we don't have to update the HTML either. Or we could just comment that out if we want. So we're not going to be updating it as HTML, but we are going to be creating the list items. So let's create the list items as we're looping through. So it's going to be the list item, and we're going to be attaching it to the unordered list. This element type is going to be a list item, and the content of it we're generating right here. So we're just applying that as the content. And this needs the backtick, so that's why it's throwing the error there. So let's see what gets generated here and do the all totals. Looks like we're throwing an error. So we've got a problem there. The HTML is undefined. So let's take a look, and we don't actually need this line anymore either. So go to all totals. And now for the list items, we want to apply the style background color to be equal to whatever we've got for the element style background color. So now when I do the totals, it's going to match up to what we got for the totals of the buttons. And you can also update the element color as well to match what the buttons. So we can just take whatever the element color is. So now whenever we do that, it's going to be all matching. And even for the output, if we want to update what we're outputting, we can also select, as we're updating the inner HTML of output area, we can take output and set the style and the background color to whatever matches for the element. So if we take this style, it's going to be selecting the element content. And we can also, because it's referencing the element, we can clean up the code as well, and we can just get the text content property, so we don't have to reference the name either, and that will also remove out a line of code and just really simplify the content that we're outputting onto the page. And it looks like we're adding to the total, so want to make sure that we're clearing out the contents, and this should actually be added into the output. So let's update that so that we only have the one output list. So it's not generating multiple output lists. And as we're clicking and we're updating, let's see where the totals are now. Go ahead and try it out. And this is just a fun exercise to learn more about creating elements and how you can attach values to those element objects that are being created dynamically with JavaScript code.